The different types of tissues found in a vascular plant can be organized into different tissue systems, each with a group of related functions. These tissue systems consist of one or more different tissue types that run throughout the plant and pass through different plant organs. The three primary tissue systems found in vascular plants are the vascular tissue system, the dermal tissue system, and the ground tissue system. The vascular tissue system functions to transport materials, including water, dissolved minerals, sugars, and proteins throughout the plant. The vascular tissue system can also provide strength and structural support to help maintain the plant's upright posture. There are two different types of tissues found in the vascular tissue system. Xylem, that conducts water and all of the dissolved materials within. Xylem only functions to transport water one way. Water is absorbed through the roots of a plant, travels upward, and is occasionally lost through evaporation through holes in the leaves called stomata that are involved in exchanging gases. Phloem transports organic nutrients like the sugar that's made through photosynthesis and the proteins that are synthesized during translation. It's very important that you remember the names xylem and phloem. The way that I like to remember phloem is that even though it starts with a PH, the F sound at the beginning of phloem is similar to food. And the nutrients transported through this type of tissue include glucose, the primary food source for the plant. So the xylem and phloem together are collectively called the stele. The stele of the root is generally a solid cylinder, also known as the vascular cylinder, that runs down the center. In stems and leaves, the stele is typically divided into smaller portions called vascular bundles, or as strands that run through the veins of leaves. Often these bundles are arranged in different types of patterns in monocots and dicots. The dermal tissue system provides the outer covering for the plant and provides a buffer between it and its environment. You should try to remember that the term dermal refers to skin. Okay, if you've ever been to a dermatologist, that's a doctor that treats someone's skin, and dermal and dermatologist come from the same root word. We'll encounter words like epidermis and other words ending in the suffix derm, meaning skin, later on in this course. In both plants and animals, the epidermis is the outermost layer of tissue and is sometimes known as skin. In non-woody plants, the epidermis is the only component of the dermal tissue system. It's a layer of densely packed cells, often covered by a waxy coating called the cuticle. The primary function of the cuticle is to help prevent water loss. In woody plants, the dermal tissue system is made up of a type of tissue called the periderm. This is a thicker, tougher material that's added to as the stems and roots grow older. So unlike the epidermis, the periderm consists of many layers of cells. So tissues that neither qualify as dermal or vascular are part of the ground tissue system. The ground tissue system can be divided into two general regions. That that's found inside of or towards the center of a stem or root, relative to the vascular tissue, is known as pith. The tissue that's found outside of or towards the periphery, relative to the vascular tissue, is called cortex. Ground tissue includes lots of specialized tissue types with functions important in photosynthesis, transporting materials across short distances, storing nutrients or minerals, or providing strength and support to the plant. Within all of the major tissue types, we also have some specific types of plant cells with important functions. They include parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, water-conducting cells found within xylem, and sugar-conducting cells, which are always found within phloem. Let's take a look at each of these within a little bit more detail. The first tissue type is called parenchyma cells. Relative to other tissue types, the cells in parenchyma have relatively thin and flexible cell walls. Okay, their cells consist of a single cell wall, whereas many other cell types also secrete a thicker secondary cell wall. Typically, these cells have a large central vacuole that holds lots of water. And that water is necessary because these parenchyma cells perform most of the metabolic functions. So this includes both photosynthesis and respiration. These cells retain the ability to divide and differentiate. Okay, remember that differentiate means to take on a more specialized function. So try to think for a moment, what tissue types would parenchyma cells be the most abundant in? Okay, if you said ground tissue, you're correct. Remember that most of the photosynthesis in a cell takes place in the ground tissue. The collenchyma cells are grouped in strands, and their primary function is to help to provide support for young growing plants. So the next tissue type is called collenchyma. Aggregations of this type of tissue are grouped in strands. Their primary function is to provide flexible support to young growing plant shoots. These cells have thicker and often slightly uneven cell walls because the plant that's growing is often changing shape, and this change in shape can cause unevenness in the cell walls. Like parenchyma cells, these cells also lack secondary cell walls. This tissue type is most common in young growing plants and tends to be lost as a plant ages. This tissue type is also the most common just below the epidermis, so it's most abundant in the ground tissue system. So the next tissue type is called sclerenchyma. These cells are thick and rigid due to secondary cell walls that contain a tough substance called lignin. This is a polymer whose primary function is to provide structural support for a plant. These sclerenchyma cells continue to provide strength and support for the plant after they've died. The two types of sclerenchyma cells, which can be found dispersed through other types of tissue, are the sclerids, which are the short and irregularly shaped cells with thick secondary cell walls. In the sclerid cells pictured at the top, you can see the lignin running between the center and the outside of the cell, and you can see that most of the cell is made up of the cell wall. Fibers, as you might expect based on the name, are much longer and slender. They can be grouped in strands and can provide tough, strong material with the ability to hold together even if a lot of pulling force is placed upon the plant. This tensile strength means that a lot of the plant materials involved in textiles, like fabric, paper, and rope, contains a large concentration of fibers. Keep in mind that these type of fibers are very different from dietary fibers. Dietary fibers actually come from polysaccharides, like the cellulose, the polysaccharide found in the cell wall of many different types of plant tissues. Okay. Water-conducting cells, which are found only in xylem, are the next tissue type. These types of cells grow and divide, but then die before they carry out their primary function. These cells are sort of like a plumbing network that transports water and any materials dissolved within them throughout the plant. Two cell types are found within this tissue type. The long, skinny, tapering, narrow cells that look kind of like a bean pod and are pictured over here on the right are known as tracheids. Water moves slowly through pits that form the junctions between these different cells. The vessel elements are much thicker, wider cells that are placed end to end. And you can remember this name because vessels are large pots or containers for carrying water. In woody plants, thick areas of xylem not only transport water, but also provide structural support, strength, and protection for the plant. The material found in a tree, commonly known as wood, is composed of xylem. So unlike the cells of the xylem, the sugar-conducting cells of the phloem remain alive to carry out their functions. The structure of these cells differs a little bit between the seedless vascular plants and gymnosperms, in which a single type of cell, called the sieve cell, transports these nutrients. In angiosperms, the function of transporting sugars and other organic materials is split between the sieve tube elements and their companion cells. The sieve tube elements provide the primary passageways for the flow of these materials and are connected by the sieve plates. these circular structures with lots of holes through which the materials can fit through. Interestingly, these cells are fairly empty. They lack organelles and a nucleus, but the companion cells, located to the side of the sieve tube elements, have a nucleus and ribosomes that control the functions of both of the cells and make the proteins necessary for both. In some species of plants, these companion cells are also involved in loading and unloading the sieve tube elements with the materials that they need to transport. So now let's take a look inside the leaf and see how cells of some of these different types work together. So all leaves will have to have an upper and a lower epidermis. That's a thin single layer of cells covered by an even thinner waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. Notice the holes found in the epidermis, both the upper and lower layer. Each of these holes is called a stoma, and the plural of stoma is stomata. The opening and closing of these holes is controlled by two guard cells, shown in this picture in purple. The opening of these cells lets in air that's rich in carbon dioxide and provides the materials needed for photosynthesis. High levels of oxygen build up within the leaf as oxygen is produced as a waste product of photosynthesis. Closing of these holes at night when photosynthesis is not taking place allows the cell to conserve water. In between the upper and lower epidermis, we see two separate layers of ground tissue known as the mesophyll. Both of these are composed of parenchyma cells. The spongy mesophyll layer is found at the bottom. Notice how in the spongy layer there's a lot of space in between different cells. So it's easy to remember that this layer is called the spongy layer because of all the holes and the sponge-like appearance. Now the space in between the cells allows for a lot of area in which gas can be exchanged. The upper layer, which is known as the palisade mesophyll, has elongated and tightly packed parenchyma cells. And the tight packing of these cells on the upper surface of the leaf is optimal for absorbing a lot of energy from the sunlight. So together these two cell layers carry out the bulk of photosynthesis within the plant. In some types of plants, stems also have a photosynthetic function, but most of the time, leaves carry out the majority of photosynthesis. Vascular tissue runs through each leaf as veins. It's an extension of the vascular system that comes up from the roots through the stem. All of the vascular tissue is enclosed in a network called a vascular bundle. The outside of the vascular bundle is enclosed by a layer of protective cells known as the bundle sheath. The bundle sheath is involved in transporting the water from the vascular system to the mesophyll cells of the leaf. Remember that water is one of the reactants, along with carbon dioxide and solar energy, in photosynthesis. After photosynthesis occurs, the sugar produced in those mesophyll cells is also transferred through the bundle sheath cells into the phloem, where it can be transported throughout the rest of the plant, as it's necessary for metabolism in all cells. These pink cells here that are located just above and just below the large vascular bundles are sclerenchyma cells. Remember that these strong cells with thick cell walls help to provide structure and support to the leaf.